Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts Podcast. We are so excited to have you with us here today.
Yes,
we
we
are
are.
going to be talking with a guest who we have had on the podcast before. In fact,
Yes.
more than once, I believe.
Yeah,
So
I
some
think
of
he's
you,
been on 3 times.
three
So,
times,
yeah.
I think might be a record, or certainly is tied for the record.
Yeah.
Dan Miller. So those
Yeah.
of you may be familiar. You've probably heard him before, but we're very,
Mhm.
fortunate to have him revisiting us today.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm loving about this season of Sunday School Dropouts is that we have been able to use so many of the practitioners at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. And there's so many different topics to hit, and so each practitioner kind of brings their own story and expertise that melds into purity culture so well. And so I think with Dan, just having done a lot of work on toxic masculinity and how purity culture impacts men and how purity culture continues to show up even after you've left it. Like if you were socialized male, I think it's just such a necessary conversation to have. And I'm really excited for it because this isn't something that is talked about all the time. And yet purity culture impacts men in very significant and long-lasting ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
before we get started, real quick disclaimer. We recognize that some of the topics we discuss in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that may require more processing or be too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you are ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience, so take what you need and leave what you don't.
Purity culture impacted my life in many negative ways, but one standout example is that my first sexual experience wound up being me being raped my freshman year of college. And then because of purity culture brain, I then entered into a relationship with that person because I had to marry them, obviously, because I had given myself to this person. And you're only allowed to do that once. And so clearly I messed that one up. And in hindsight, now almost 20 years later, even when I talk about this in therapy, the assault is not where my trauma lies. My trauma lies in the purity culture and what that did to me psychologically when this happened. Because I felt like I didn't have I've ruined everything that I had worked for, my whole life. I was no longer pure and so therefore unlovable. And I think that adds another element to an already traumatic experience.
I understand that deeply. Like I can, that it is very close to my own experiences and recognizing that, that it was like the after pieces that were more traumatizing than the actual thing. I think is it Gabor Mate or Peter Levine that talks about like sometimes the trauma doesn't live in our body from what happened, but either from what didn't happen or what should have happened or like the response from somebody after it. And I mean, I think that's what this person is describing. And I know I felt that too.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I resonate with that idea of like, of really believing like, well, I've already had sex with this person, so therefore I deserve what they're doing to me. I don't have a choice. Like I've like made my bed, now I have to sleep in it type of thing. And purity culture really grooms you to be in these abusive relationships and to be repeatedly assaulted and victimized. I'm really appreciative that she shared her story, but I'm really just so sad that was her experience.
Yeah, I agree with it. It's almost like just that idea, like it was really not even in that case, like the assault itself. It was like all of the messaging, what purity culture itself told her about herself, like, and as far as like what you should do, your worth, your own bodily autonomy and agency and all of those things. And I, and then I imagine just how the church did or didn't support, and unfortunately it's a story that I've heard far too often, both personal acquaintances, but also professionally.
Okay, it is time for some listener questions. We got some good ones today. Andrew, I'm going to ask you the first one. The person says, I don't know what I actually want sexually. I know what I was told to not want. How do I begin to discover that?
What I would start with is it's not even overtly about sex where I would start. It's
Yeah.
really more about first just becoming curious about and in tune with your body, like what that even
Yeah.
feels like, what different experiences feel like. And then once you've done that, start just being curious about what do you find that feels pleasurable physically. And
Yeah.
and again, I don't even necessarily mean sexually. It could literally be like, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? What does it feel like when
Yes.
you eat that? What is your favorite music? Like when you hear that, what do you notice shifting in your body? Things like that, things that we would call glimmers in polyvagal theory, like things that
Yeah.
is like a pleasure nervous system response, basically. And
Mm-hmm.
really, that's where I would start. I wouldn't start.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go straight to sex, especially if
Yeah.
these are things you've never been allowed to really think about or contemplate
Mm-hmm.
before.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with that. Like, as soon as I read that question, I thought, okay, let's start way before, or let's start with something that doesn't even have to do with sex. Like, how do you know that you want anything or that you don't want anything? And like play around with that a little bit. So, if somebody asks you a question, do you want to go do this or whatever? Like, notice, like, do I want to? What in my body tells me it's a yes or a no? I do a fun game with my clients sometimes where I will have them go to Costco on a Saturday because that's when they ask, like, if you want all the free samples of food. And so I will have them go around to all the sample stations because they're asking you, like, oh, would you like a sample of this or that or whatever? And their job is to really, like, the client's job is to like tune in. Do I want this? Do I not? And then answer accordingly. Right. And so, and to practice saying no or to practice saying yes. And the thing is, like, the person giving out the samples is not going to remember you and they're not going to care. Right. So it's like a really low stakes way of like just getting in tune with like, what is my yes? What is my no? How do I know that I want that? What in my body is a yes, like tells me it's a yes or a no. And so I like to start in very like non-sexual ways, neutral ways where there's like not really a cost, it's independent of saying yes or no. It's just practicing tuning in to what do I want. And you can use that with pleasure too. Like you were saying, Andrew, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to listen to this music. I'm going to find a scent that I really love and notice like, how does that feel as I'm inhaling that? There's so many ways to engage with what you want and what is pleasurable or what you desire that has nothing to do with sex. And then maybe slowly transitioning it to like touch and then maybe sex, but like even noticing like what clothing feels really good against my skin. What do I, like when I wear a wool sweater versus a cotton sweater, like how does my body respond to it? Do I like one or the other? Does one feel cozy and one feels itchy? It's really so much about just really getting in tune with your body and what feels good for you. And then you can play around with touch. Do I like firmer touch, lighter touch? If you're, kind of stroking your arm versus scratching your arm. Like, I just feel like there's so much more to get to know about our bodies and wants and desires that then can naturally transition into the sex piece, whether that's solo sex, sex with a partner or partners. But sometimes we have to like take sex off the table or sexual pleasure off the table and really focus on just getting in tune with other wants and desires and pleasure, and then naturally let that turn into like sexual things, sexual activities, sexual pleasure.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question.
So the next question is, how do I handle it when my parents or in-laws try to push purity messages on my kids?
Oh, I get this. I hear this a lot. Okay, yeah. So the two thoughts that come to mind is you as the parent are responsible for setting the boundaries with your own parents or in-laws or other adults in your life. And so that may look like having some pretty frank conversations with somebody saying like, hey, we're choosing to not teach our kids these things. And so either we would appreciate you kind of being in alignment with what we're teaching or just maybe don't talk about that at all. Like that's not something that you need to have a conversation with. If people are respectful of that, you can find so many other things then to have conversations about and ways to connect. If they're not respectful of that, of course, then you might have to invoke some other boundaries, whether that's the amount of time that's spent with them or, whatever. And then the other thing that comes to mind, because we can't always know all the messages that children are getting, But one of the ways that we can help our kids is by keeping an open door so that when kids are hearing messages that are different than what you are talking about with them and they have questions, they can come to you and say, hey, grandma talked to me about this, or my friend at school told me this or that or whatever. And you become a safe landing space for them to ask questions, to have safe dialogue, to learn how to critically think and flesh things out, which is going to be a skill that will serve them really well for the rest of their lives. So those are the two things that come to mind for me. What do you think, Andrew?
I mean, pretty much the same. I think it's just, it's gonna. I mean, boundaries. The thing is, there's really no way around it without having some frank and
Totally.
possibly uncomfortable conversations.
Mhm.
And so, I think just clarifying for yourself, what is the request? What is it that you need your parents or in-laws to understand and to not do, and be clear on that? Like, what are you actually asking specifically? And then also knowing that, hopefully they respect it, but also just being clear about, well, what is the boundary? Like, what is the response to, if they don't respect this request, what are you going to do about it, basically?
Yeah.
And I don't mean that to
Yeah.
sound like a total power struggle, but that is what
Mm-hmm.
it is. It's like, I can't control their behavior, but I
Yeah.
can respond if you insist on not respecting the request. And hopefully that they'll be respectful. But if not, I also just want to add that even if they get upset, that does not inherently mean you did anything wrong, said anything wrong, or were unkind. So I do want to say that,
Absolutely. Yeah.
like, if it may be a dynamic where they are not accustomed to their kids or grown children in this case, who are now parents on their own, coming and being like, you maybe raised me this way, but this is how I'm raising my kids. And I would appreciate this not being said around them or to them. And, it might be a difficult thing for them to hear, but anyway, I trust that, you can do it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to show my reality TV weird side for just a second, because it has to do with just this. If people watch Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, one of the major themes through it is there's several of the women that grew up in fundamentalist Mormon homes. So, of course, we have all these purity culture rules, things like that. And there's one person in particular, her name is Bronwyn. And she went to BYU for college. She got pregnant when she was like 19, 20 years old, decided to keep the baby. And, she was hiding from her parents that she was drinking, that she was having sex, things like that. These were like literal conversations that she was having on the show of season 6. And fast forward, her daughter is like 19 or 20 years old right now, and daughter still lives at home. And interestingly, Bronwyn has moved her parents also into the home, their aging parents. And there was a conversation where the daughter, who's 19 or 20, is telling the mom essentially like, my boyfriend and I are having sex. We're going to have some private time. And the grandmother is hearing this and is just kind of like, ugh, like, whatever. I can't believe that you allowed this under your roof. And like, why is it okay for your daughter to tell you these things? And it was this really interesting conversation where Bronwyn, the character, the person that is part of the cast of Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, was saying, I didn't want to raise my child the same way that you did. I want her to tell me things. I want her to talk to me. And the mom is saying like, yeah, but look how she's turning out. She's like having premarital sex. She's, drinking or, whatever. And Bronwyn is going, yeah, but you didn't want to hear that. Like, I didn't have a way to talk to you about that. And I don't really think that worked very well, because I was doing those things, but it just was in secret. And then I didn't have the support I needed when I did get pregnant, right? It was just such an interesting conversation to see this like generational parenting and differences all around these purity culture rules. And to be like, yeah, there really is, when there is that secrecy and shame that's attached to it, it really hits the core of who you are, and you have to hide everything, and you don't have the support that you need. And even though maybe Bronwyn doesn't agree with some of her daughter's choices, I don't even know, like, her daughter trusts her. Like, her daughter is willing to be open and honest with her and knows she has the support of her mother, because they have this open dialogue and this ability to say like, hey, I'm going to raise you a little bit differently than how I was raised, so that you always know that you are loved and supported no matter what. I'm going to help you figure this out. And I think that like that just came up for me as we were answering this question, because I think so many of us grew up in these environments where we would have been like, told, no, you can't do these things, so much silence, shame, secrecy. And like, just what a gift it is to have parents who are willing to engage with their kids, even in uncomfortable topics, and to say, I'm going to do this a little bit differently, but I'm going to do it knowing that my kid will always feel my support and always feel permission to talk to me about whatever, and I will advocate for them. So anyways, sometimes reality TV does have its redeeming qualities.
No, I love that.
Yeah, I love it.
Here is a story from one of our listeners. I entered into a marriage with what turned out to be an emotionally abusive narcissist at the age of 21. I thought sexual desire meant we should get married, and since sex was the next logical step and couldn't happen outside of marriage without ruining our lives, we got married. 23 years and 6 kids later, I've left the church, realized my bisexuality, and am going through a divorce. Purity culture kept me from exploring who I really am for decades of my life. I was chained to ideals that go against normal, healthy human development. Purity culture robbed me of 30 years I can never get back.
Yeah. I really appreciate that person sharing. I get it. I think this is, I know we say this a lot, but this is so common, right? Like to hear stories like this where people are getting married to the probably wrong person because that's the only way you can have sex. And in your, not fully developed brain, this makes sense, right? And it makes sense spiritually. And then, we have decades later of grief and so much heartache and pain as a result.
Yeah. Yeah, this just shows too, just the lens, like we just said, grief, but the lens of grief can be so important in healing all of this. Like there is trauma work to be done. There's other things we can focus on, but grief is really important because I think there's still so many amazing, wonderful things that your life will have to offer. And also not trying to sugarcoat the fact that, it sucks. Like there are 3 decades that you're right. I mean, you're not going to get those decades back.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is a very painful thing to have to reconcile.
I think that's right. Grief is where it's at. So thank you for sharing that to the listener who submitted that story. Dan Miller is a scholar, podcaster, and advocate whose journey began in the heart of American evangelicalism. After earning his bachelor's in religion from Oklahoma Baptist University, a master of studies in theology from Oxford, and a master's of divinity from a Southern Baptist seminary, Dan served for 5 years as a pastor in a conservative evangelical church. As his support for social justice and LGBTQ+ inclusion grew, Dan found himself questioning the doctrines he once upheld, a process that ultimately led him to leave evangelicalism nearly 2 decades ago. He went on to earn a PhD in religious studies from Syracuse University, equipping him with the critical tools to analyze the intersections of faith, culture, and power.
Today, Dan is a practitioner at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery and co-hosts the podcast Straight White American Jesus, where he explores the complexities of religion and politics and supports others recovering from religious trauma. Dan is passionate about helping people heal from religious harm, rediscover their values, and build lives rooted in authenticity. When not working or podcasting, he enjoys time with his kids, cheering on the Denver Broncos, baking bread, and relaxing with video games.
Welcome, Dan Miller, to the podcast. It is so good to have you here for the 3rd time. I feel like you were like Saturday Night Live, where you get a coat, if you've been on the podcast enough times. So you are like well on your way to getting our 5-peat, Sunday school dropouts.
I'll send you my measurements for the yellow blazer or whatever it is, right? I'll send those over.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Do that. I don't know. Did you guys get awards in Sunday school? Maybe that's what we could do. Is like some sort of Sunday school award, for being on the pod.
This will make no sense to people who didn't grow up there, but the sword drill. Remember that? You had memorize Bible verses and the Bible passage about the Bible being the sword. You the sword drill. So
yep.
Which I sort of ironically sucked at. I was never good at memorizing Bible verses, and you would think, given my background, that's something I would have done all the time. But but we did. We got little awards and little certificates, and my mom probably still had some in her house when we cleaned it out, in boxes somewhere. So yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, we will come up with some sort of Sunday school dropouts award that after you have been on the podcast a certain number of times, you will join an elite club, closer to God or something like that, But for those people who have not heard you on the podcast the last couple times, maybe if you just want to kind of, share a little bit about yourself, kind of your background inside of high control religion and specifically purity culture, since that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah. So I when I was in high school, I grew up in a family that sort of hopped around church to church kind of thing, but somewhere in like, I don't know, late grade school, middle school, kind of settled on one. And it always been there, I guess, nominally Christian, had a good sense of guilt all the time, all that kind of stuff, but like, nothing real firm. But when I was in high school, I went on a youth group trip to Mexico, a mission trip, and I had this very profound sense of calling that I was called to be a pastor. And that's when I became like super evangelical kid. So that was in Colorado. My family moved to Arkansas. I became part of a Southern Baptist church, and I was that church kid. I was the one who voluntarily went all the time, Sunday, Wednesday, every event. I led what were called devotionals, right, in the youth group, like the sort of little mini sermons that you would give to the other youth group kids. And in terms of purity culture, I was all in. I was kind of that first wave of True Love Waits. My card was one of those cards on the National Mall that they posted and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I was a true believer, right? Really believed that, you needed to wait till you were married to have sex and all that stuff. Went to college at a Baptist college, training to, eventually go to seminary and so forth. Was ordained after that. Pastored a church in Seattle, Washington. I was one of two pastors there, and then went to seminary and earned my MDiv while I was doing that. Also, at that time, was having doubts about evangelicalism and high control religion. We didn't, of course, have the language of high control religion then, but when I say evangelicalism, but we just put that under that umbrella. I was not an inerrantist. I believed that women could be ordained. I had some real doubts about the views of LGBTQ people within evangelicalism. The 2000 election, I voted for Gore secretly, like sort of very undercover and so on. So I pastored there for 5 years, left to go and pursue further studies, and knew when I did, I was done with evangelicalism. Wasn't sure what that would mean, but eventually went on, got a PhD in religious studies, which is what I do now. And for the last almost 10 years, I guess, been co-hosting Straight White American Jesus and trying to bring those religious studies background pieces together with those former insider pieces of being within purity culture and high control religion, and reflecting on sort of what all of that means. So that's sort of a weird mix that is me at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. You were in. I love it. I mean,
was
we
all
would have
in.
been we would have been friends in another life too. So
Yeah. Well, and the me now, I have these conversations that maybe only coaches and therapists have, right? Where you're like, what would I be like if I met me at 19 now? And 19-year-old me would have grave concerns about
Very much
middle-aged
so,
me
yeah.
at this point. I'm the cautionary tale, I guess, of what happens if you learn too much or whatever.
Going down the slippery slope of education and questions.
That's right.
Yeah.
You went down it.
Yeah.
Love it.
I always laugh, or it amuses me, the question, or like when people frame that idea that like your younger self would be proud of you. Like my younger religious self would actually be terrified of who I've become for so many reasons. And I mean, I'm happy with where I am now, but like this idea that like, oh no, your younger self would be happy about it.
Yeah. Well, I
don't know.
Middle-aged me would pat younger me on the head and be like, oh, bless your heart, that kind of thing. And look at how serious you are about this. It's, you'll figure it out. So,
yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to get into this purity culture, and purity culture is, of course, what our entire season is about, but specifically as it affects men. And so, I'm really excited to have you on today. And yeah, I just kind of want to get right into that. What were some of the ways that you have felt personally, purity culture impacting you, even after having like cognitively deconstructed it?
Yeah. So I think we were talking before the show, right, that for lots of reasons, the focus on purity culture, I think, is primarily on women. And I should say, I know that you'll have talked about this. It'll come out again, but we use a lot of men and women language here, right? And just to frame that within purity culture, there are only two genders, men and women. And so, if I use that language, I'm not trying to be exclusionary. It's just that within that frame, that's all there is, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of focus on the effects on women and female identified people for lots of reasons, I think. But I think there hasn't been a lot of focus on the effects on men. And because one reason is that in some ways, and we'll get into this, I think, men are kind of the winners in purity culture, right, in a lot of ways. But there are ways where I think it really damages them as well. And I think I'm fortunate in that, if we talk about trauma studies and things like that, I don't think I experienced some of the most traumatic effects of purity culture. I think once I sort of was out of it, I was sort of out of it. And, in ways that, obviously trauma and background affects everybody differently. I didn't have some of the same kinds of issues that I've found in my clients with the center or just in conversations with other people. But other things that I still find myself being aware of are, for example, certain conceptions of embodiment. And so I had this realization just a couple months ago. I was talking to somebody, and I suddenly had this realization that things I was dealing with were all wrapped up in a certain kind of masculine modesty culture. And this friend was like, yeah, no kidding. I'm like, well, I kind of had never really realized that was a thing. And, it's so often the inverse, or maybe not the inverse, but different than what women have, conceptions of embodiment, certainly conceptions of what it is to be, quote unquote, manly or masculine, and what that means and what the parameters of that are and what it is. I was always able to pass as maybe not what they would call the alpha now, but I played football and I was big and I was strong and I'm a straight guy. And I slotted into a lot of those things and did okay. But as I got older, even outside of that culture and opening up to things like, queer inclusion and different understandings of embodiment or maybe just more varied conceptions of sexuality or things like that, even that sense of like, well, how do you map that onto yourself? Or what is it to be, quote unquote, masculine and affirm these kind of things when we kind of don't have a model of masculinity oftentimes that does incorporate all of that. It's the term masculinity, I think, has been so co-opted into a particular conception of masculinity, of sort of exhausting it, that it's hard to position oneself. And I think I've wrestled with those things over time. And also seeing that in like lots of other people and different ways that it plays out in, as I say, clients and people that I've met and people that I talked to through the podcast work and things like that. But I think for me specifically, and it just sort of stands out recently, a lot of things about sort of embodiment and conceptions of what embodiment is if you're a male identified person and how that operates.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. Would you feel comfortable going a little deeper into like when you say embodiment or kind of like how men are supposed to be or how they're supposed to show up through that system of purity culture or patriarchy generally? What are some of those specific messages?
Yeah. So I think you've got certain conceptions of like, this weird thing of, on one hand, physical embodiment and it determines you, right? I think one of the things about purity culture and the way that it conceives of masculinity is that men by nature are sexually voracious. They are, sexually dominant. Left to their own fallen, nature, they will be predatory. They will be, promiscuous. They will be, all of these kinds of things. It's like we're basically an embodied libido, and that's kind of all. And that can be really debilitating if, number one, if somebody's not, or if that's just not how they're wired, or I'm a middle-aged guy now. Things are different than they were when I was 17, 18, 19, right? Like, I don't remember ever hearing about any sort of like, I don't know, what has purity work over a life cycle or, something like that kind of thing. Because it was, I think it originates in a lot of ways as a way to regulate teenagers, or at least that's how it operates in churches. So I think that's one piece of it. I think notions of changing desire or desire, even for people who would identify as straight or hetero, but don't fit into a narrow category of what that means to express that sexually. I did a whole series on my podcast about, sexuality within high control religion. And not to get like too graphic or detailed, but like sex is, it's penis and vagina sex. That's what sex is. And you're like, yeah, there's a lot more to it than that, as it turns out. I'm told, right? Discomfort with that, the whole notion of desire, sort of strangely, there's a sense in which men are intended to be, sort of, as I say, sexually voracious, but it's not usually couched in terms of desire or fulfillment. Those are more feminine notions, right? Like women are supposed to seek fulfillment and emotional support and so forth. Men are just these kind of, sex machines that, I've been reading Christian sex guides recently.
Interesting.
It is interesting. And there are some really bad ones, but they have this whole thing about, the woman's responsibility is to have sex with her husband, no less frequently than every 72 hours, right?
Wow.
And the idea just being that that's what men are, that's what men need. If you talk about, like, there's not a lot of discussion oftentimes about men's emotional needs or that language of emotion. And so I think all of those are pieces of that. I think, obviously, other kinds of issues related to embodiment of, just body image and things, again, a certain kind of conception of what that is. I think that's really pronounced now with all the focus on a kind of hyper masculine alpha male thing where we've got like Pete Hegseth doing pull-ups at the, army bases and, things like that. If you don't fit that, where do you fit? What is that? If you are not a physically oriented person, and I was always that, but I'm an academic. I'm a nerd. Like, where does that fit in? I think that notion, as well as, so on one hand, you've got this, we're kind of dominated by our bodies. We're just sexual desire or whatever. But on the other hand, there's this weird thing of not, almost like the embodiment of men is ignored or irrelevant. There's not a lot of discussion of, I don't know, men wanting to feel attractive, say, or feeling that that's a thing that they need to do or that they struggle with, which of course we do, because who doesn't want people in the world to look at them and be like, hey, I like that person. But I think a certain weird distancing from the body at the same time that we're also dominated by a certain conception of embodiment and all the tensions that raises. These are all things I think I've really found myself reflecting on a lot over the last several years.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like, and that, correct me if I'm wrong, since I did not grow up male, but it seems like your body is like the only way you're embodied is this sexual way, right? Like here's this one purpose, but there is like a divorce from your body from every other way. Any physiological sensation, emotion, anything like that doesn't have to do with being sexually turned on is not something that you have any sort of connection or even language about, is kind of what
all you have to think about is it's not even limited to high control religion, right? This kind of older cultural discourse about, women are emotional and men are what? They're either rational or they always want sex. Like those are the two options, right? That's it.
Yeah.
I guess when we're not pondering deep thoughts, we want to get laid. That's all that there is, right? Yeah,
that's like a T-shirt or something.
Yeah, notions that you be masculine, to be embodied, to be a male person, to be a person, right, is to have this complex array of emotions and emotional needs and desires and things like that. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, as you talk about this, I think really illustrates it. And I've talked with a couple people recently who have been reflecting on this, and is men who don't know how to engage in touch with like a partner, but like non-sexual physical contact, because physical contact is supposed to always lead to sex, right?
Yes.
I said I was the true believer, right? And the way that the youth group messages went is, maybe you hold hands, maybe you can cuddle up on the couch, that's fine, but you really got to be careful because everything's a slippery slope.
Yes.
Everything leads to sex. And I think for people who really believe it and buy into that, even when they enter into relationships, even when they get married, physical contact is supposed to lead in that direction. And so they're not good at engaging in physical contact or experiencing physical touch that isn't going to culminate in that way. So you get into complex things for people who, like, physical touch is really important to them, or, it's something that they need. And we all need it to some extent, obviously. But the kind of disconnect that can come there, where there's an equivalence, just an equation that is drawn between physical touch or physical intimacy in some sort and sex, tie that in where emotion always amounts to sexual desire. Like that's the only emotion you have, basically, is this kind of desire. And it leads to this really truncated sense of like, here's who I'm supposed to be as a person, which is of course going to be at odds with what we actually feel and what we actually experience, and all the dissonance that comes from that is what causes so many problems for so many people.
Yeah.
And actually speaking to that, like the problems that you are seeing, like what are some of the long-term impacts that you've seen in men who are raised in these types of environments where, they strictly enforce masculine purity culture?
I was thinking about this, over the last couple of days, and I think there's probably a continuum you could map on like one far extreme. And I don't know that this, I would say this is not typical, but I've known men who, they're married, they're with a partner, they're monogamous, they, in some cases fulfilled the purity vow, they waited till they were married, all of that, and they feel guilty every time they have sex with their partner. They are worried that they are violating them in some way, that they're giving into those, they've so internalized that men are inherently predatory sexual beings that they fear that they are somehow violating their partner. And, sometimes this is an open discussion with them and their partner. The partner's very clear, like this is not what this is. I consent. All of that, but they're hung up on that and can't just open up to experience that. On another extreme are probably the people for whom, like, maybe the sexual functioning is fine, but you run into those issues I say of like just physical touch or being with another person and experiencing or expressing desire or affection or care in ways that are non-sexual, not knowing how to do that because that was the sort of all or nothing internalized message from within purity culture. I'm thinking of, I think actually, I've met people, but Linda K. Klein in her book on purity, I think tells a story of a guy that has always stuck with me who talks about viewing women almost as floating heads, like as not embodied, right? Of being so worried about objectifying women or thinking of them in that way that you kind of can't appreciate them as a holistic sort of person, and have seen that. All kinds of issues with jealousy and misplaced emotion, right? Because I think another knock-on effect often in purity culture is really hard for men and women to be friends, right? Because everything's always going to lead to sex. That's all it's going to be. If you don't know that you're going to marry somebody, you shouldn't date them. You shouldn't hang around with them. If you know that whole courtship model, all of it. And so even into adult life, men who don't know how to relate in a sort of productive or professional or whatever way with women, because they're hung up on these notions that it's always going to lead to something, or that you can't do that, or that you're going to, it's just so socially disruptive on so many levels, whether that's with friends or, as I say, coworkers, or, the old Mike Pence thing about never meeting in a room with the door closed with a woman and all that kind of stuff. And all of that, of course, is to say nothing of people who are transgender or gender fluid, or whose sexual orientation would fall somewhere on a spectrum and they don't fit neatly into one category or another. I've had a number of clients who will say, well, I've never been very masculine. And I'll be like, can you say more about, like, what do you mean you've never been very masculine? And they're cisgender, they're straight, but they don't tick those boxes of a certain kind of masculinity, and they don't have any other model of what masculine is. So they're just like, well, I'm not masculine. I'm like, well, there's a lot of ways to be masculine, right? But for them, there's only one. It was this kind of ideal stereotype, and they don't fit it. So they're not masculine, and so they don't know where they fit or how they can relate to other people, or they're afraid that they'll never find a partner, or, what have you. So a lot of different ways that I think that plays out. To say nothing of, again, in lots of ways, people who have all kinds of problems with sexual functioning, right? Because spent a lot of years learning to tamp down those feelings, and like sort of what should be sort of a dimmer switch is like an on or off switch. And it turns out that when they turned all those emotions off and suppress them and whatever, it's hard to get them to kind of operate in a way that isn't short-circuited by feelings of guilt or shame or inadequacy, or just a lack of kind of normal socialization. I guess I shouldn't use the word normal. But I often say to clients who are struggling with that in many ways, I mean, you're figuring out now what everybody struggled through in like middle school and high school. Like a lot of those initial interactions, and things are messy, and I don't know how to read what this other person's saying. And we tried to do this thing and it did not go as well as it does in the movies, or, whatever. Which is all normal, but for them, they don't know that that's normal, because the purity culture thing is all that stuff's just supposed to happen. It's just supposed to work. And they didn't do that when they were younger. And I realized people develop at different ways and different paces and whatever. But now as adults, some of them well into their 30s or 40s, they feel like 15-year-olds having some of these first encounters and trying to figure that out. And they feel very out of place and alone because of that. So a lot of ways that I think I see that playing out.
Yeah. That's really, interesting. I agree. I mean, just in my client work, I see so much of that also.
Yeah, same.
I think one of my biggest, it's not even a regret, because like I didn't actually have a say in it, but like that idea of like the slow progression, like the dimmer switch, we all did not have that. We were taught, it's like, it literally is an on off switch. It's no, until these magical words where you sign this legal document and then it's a yes. But like, in middle school, you're like holding hands for the first time, and like that's enough at that point. Like you're talking about like learning touch just to like interact with somebody. And it's like, Yeah, that's like the biggest deal in the world when you are holding hands with your crush sitting next to the bus on, like, and you're just like, oh my God, we just did that, right? And
Or
it's
even
like, that's all.
getting that person to sit with you on the bus, all that stuff,
Yes.
right? Like just the fact
Yeah.
that they're sitting with you on the bus or they're sitting closer than they
Yes.
had to. You can feel it, all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Or
Yeah.
you touch pinkies or something and you're just, like, it's, and I feel like so many people like missed out on that, because we had to be so rigid and then we see these effects later on in life where it's like you can't even have, like just safe touch between two adults of differing genders. And, because, I don't know. It's probably good I'm not in the same room with you guys because you just never know what could happen,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It could all just get crazy. Yeah. There's
Could
no,
just get crazy.
yeah, selling everybody so short on like, sort of
Yeah.
human capabilities in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know we talked a little bit about purity culture. I want to talk about patriarchy just kind of generally and like how it interacts with purity culture. So maybe if you want to talk a little bit about like how patriarchy frames men or masculinity and then, how purity culture can even like glob onto that and, reduce it even more, in a rigid box of like what masculinity is.
Yeah, so patriarchy, of course. I mean, I mentioned earlier that men are kind of the winners, and so obviously, like patriarchy is the like men win it kind of discourse. And I don't anything I say about patriarchy being damaging or harmful to men. I don't want that to somehow be taken as, oh, men have a hard time in patriarchy too.
Sure.
Yes, the men are the winners, but it does come with costs for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, patriarchy just generally, right? Things that where I think it plays in very strongly are, especially if you like in a Christian concept or a Christian framework, this whole notion of male headship, right? That the man is the head of the family, the head of society, that the woman, insofar as she sort of figures it all, is there to support the man and so on. We know that as time has gone on and we live in an economic situation where men often can't be the sole, breadwinner or whatever, that sort of morphs into like spiritual headship. It's a spiritual role, not necessarily, woman needs to stay in the house all the time kind of role. But I think it plays out, right? This notion of male authority, male headship, a certain notion of, everything else in the family ought to be in deference to men, right? And within that, I think you can have, harder or softer versions of that. You can have a kinder, gentler patriarchy, right? It's sort of like having an enlightened despotism, right? Like, yes, father knows best and is in charge, but he's really caring and he can cry and he's in touch with his emotions or whatever. But the man is still in charge. The man is the leader, the one who benefits from this. And we all know how this plays out in lots of ways, right? If a decision has to be made to, move the family for somebody's career, it's going to be the man's career. Still typically in lots of circumstances, if, there's a child who's born and somebody's going to have to stop working to stay home and, do childcare, because that's the kind of country we live in. Somebody has to do that. It's typically going to be the woman and so forth. Right. So I think in terms of, if you take like that broad overarching structure of the authority of men, the privilege of men, the deference to men, right. All of that stuff, and you merge it into purity culture. I mean, yeah, they're in charge, but it's also a lot of weight for men to carry. I remember as a high schooler, this dual kind of tension. I was dating a girl for a long time, and we weren't engaged, but thought we would be someday, and that was all part of the thing of these kind of conflicting messages. Where on one hand, you're supposed to be the leader, you're the one who's supposed to be making sure that everybody is following God's will and doing what God wants and knowing what that is. But you're also the one whose sinful nature is going to lead you down this path that is going to destroy not only your purity, but theirs. And I remember just the feeling of responsibility that was. It was supposed to be my responsibility to have to watch out, not just for my standing before God, but for the standing of anybody that I would date or anybody I would be around. That's a lot of weight to bear. You take other just basic things like that model of male headship is so much a model of now, again, I think everybody's familiar with the alpha male kind of model, but that was still sort of the ideal. I don't know, just if nothing else, guys that are very extroverted, people that play sports and they're outgoing and they're leaders. And, and if you get the quiet artistic type, the person who's not into that, the introverted type who wants to sit at home and read all the time, or just they're not the person that everybody in the room is going to gravitate toward and whatever, they're not fulfilling that masculine role. they're not fitting in within patriarchy the way that they're supposed to. But then I think within purity culture, again, it sort of melds into that. And I think part of what happens is I often tell clients when I'm working with them that, we've got all these kind of cultural things anyway. And I refer to them as kind of like a mixing board. You imagine the soundboard with all the sliders, right? And what religion often does is comes along, takes a couple of those sliders and just turns them like all the way up.
Yeah.
So in a patriarchal system, there's already pressure on men to be men in a certain kind of way, to take on a certain kind of responsibility, that if they take it seriously, the decisions they make are going to affect everybody and they have to get them right. And if they don't and everything goes sideways, it's their fault. I mean, that's a lot of weight to bear. But now we got God putting it on us. It's not just a social expectation. It's coming from God. And it's not just about, I don't know, making good decisions for the future or whatever. It's about sexuality and sexual expression. And you can derail not just your life, but somebody else's entire life and drag them away from what God intends for them because you're, a horny teenager doing what horny teenagers do, right? And, it's invested with this weight that you cannot possibly carry as a young man, in this case, carrying that around, let alone an adult and carrying all that weight. So I think that they meld onto each other in a lot of ways. And it's a mutually reinforcing system, I think, purity culture and patriarchy. And it is damaging, I think, to women in lots of ways. But I think it has these really damaging effects for men, even the men who ostensibly benefit from it and often do experience real benefits from it. I feel like there's a sense in which that those benefits are still coming at a cost of what else they could be, of what other dimensions of themselves could be unlocked, or of recognizing the range and diversity of what, masculinity might be and so forth. I think even for the winners, there's a cost that comes with that.
Yeah. It's so much pressure. I have, obviously a lot of male family members, immediate, extended, whatever. And I remember hearing a story once of somebody that, one of them had dated, like, I don't know if they had a baby before they got married or something like that. But their response to hearing the news was like, did I create that because I might have gone too far with this person in this relationship, that I then kind of like opened this door for then this person to go further? And I was just like, oh my gosh, like you were 15, 16 years old. This person is in their mid-20s, like made their own choices, and I remember just thinking like, that's so much heavy weight to carry for this person's like eternity, not only in heaven, but their choices that will happen here on earth. Yeah. It's wild to me.
I mean, there's this awful, both of you know it, a lot of listeners are going to know it, this awful like object lesson that is often done in like these purity culture circles, the one with like the gum or the flower, right? It's like some person chews a piece of gum and it's like, would you want to chew this piece of gum after everybody else has? And no, of course you wouldn't. And the rose that you hand around, everybody plucks a petal and there's nothing left. And that's usually aimed at women, right? To say it's not, but it's aimed at women, right? That if you are a woman who has had sexual partners, you're tainted and you're bringing that with you into future relationships and so forth. But if you're a man, a guy who believes strongly in purity culture, you bear the responsibility for that taint. Like if you're one of those further up the line or whatever, or maybe the first person that somebody was with, or, you went, quote unquote, you went further than they had before. My camera's being weird.
He's got a lot of Dan right there.
Which is a lot of me.
Dramatic zoom in.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll deal with that in a minute. You have all of that stuff, and now you feel the responsibility for that.
Yeah.
As you say, it's not their choices. It's not just that they did things and they were an adult and they chose to, get involved or do whatever they did. No. You're the one who tainted them, who broke them, who, did these kind of things. And that's a huge amount of weight to bear, especially if somebody's like a teenager, or something like that. And so I think that illustrates the kind of issue that we're talking about here.
And talking about just cost, I know you've stated like how, men are the winners of this, but there is still a cost. And I think that articulates it well. So one of patriarchy's most damaging lies, at least I think most of us would agree, is that vulnerability equals weakness. And I'm just curious how you see that. How does that show up in men's spiritual lives, their bodies, their relationships? How does that impact men?
Yeah. It's my answer to everything is always that it's complicated and weird and, whatever. On one hand, you've got this Christian context and you're supposed to be vulnerable, where we're all sinful, we're all fallen, nobody's better than anybody else and whatever. In practice, that's not how it gets to work, right? As you say, vulnerability is weakness. And so you are called as a man to be this leader and so forth, and you really can't do anything wrong. To admit that you're wrong it's not just to admit weakness, it's to admit that you didn't do what God wanted you to do. You didn't do what you were supposed to do, or you failed in some way. And so you can't just admit vulnerability and say, oh, we didn't know what we were doing, or I made a mistake, or, whatever. You can't, because then you're not a good leader, or you're not. I think on the really toxic end, we see that again with the alpha discourse, right? You never admit that you're wrong. We see this, or you never tell somebody you're wrong. Vulnerability can only be weakness. And so you internalize all of that. And I think what it does, if we circle all the way back around to the lack of communicating with emotion and being in touch with one's emotions, what is it to feel fear? What is it to feel anxiety? What is it to feel just lost, right? I don't know what I'm feeling. I don't know how to do this, and so forth. One of the ways that I think this played out for me for a lot of years, I spent some time in counseling on my own because of it, is I was angry a lot, like all the time. I remember when the first time a counselor said to me that anger is a secondary emotion, and sort of put before me and said, if you can learn to name what emotion is going on underneath it, that might open some things up for you. And for me, it really did. I was like, I would learn to pause and say, okay, like I'm angry, but am I really? And I realized, no, I'm insecure, or I'm scared, and for me, anger it's a way of feeling like you've got control when you don't. Or I often liken it to, if you're stuck in traffic and you take that detour that's no faster, it may be longer, right? But you feel like you're getting somewhere because you're moving. It's like there's a lot of motion.
Yeah.
You're not moving forward, but you're moving around. And so you feel like you're getting somewhere. That's what anger would do for me. And I think that was all, looking back at some of those effects, not being able to admit vulnerability, not being able to admit complex emotions like, anxiety or fear or just uncertainty, and those kinds of things. And I think what it does is it damages relationships with others, obviously. But I think it also gives us, again, a very, I keep using this word, truncated or stunted, this very stunted sense of our own emotional complexity and who and what we are. And even within a Christian framework, right? If one wanted to operate there, within everything that, you as a child of God, or, all these other things that the Christians would say they believed, it gives a very attenuated vision of what that actually is and what that can be and all the ways that can play out. And so I think it's a really big one. And that equation, as you say, of vulnerability with weakness, I think it's really significant. I think it's interesting. I'm thinking of Kristen Dumais' book, Jesus and John Wayne, which lots of people will be familiar with. But she tracks, and I remember this well, where you had this moment in the 90s where there was a move to try to combat that, I think, within that kind of evangelical high control religion framework, with like Promise Keepers and things like that. You had that kinder, gentler masculinity. We're going to be men, but we'll cry and we'll admit emotions and so forth. And it just didn't win out. It didn't win the cultural discourse. It lost. And so you got that. I think we see in so many ways the effects of that, whether it's on men for themselves, whether it's on relationships with others, whether it's socially. We see what happens where you have a discourse where people can't be vulnerable. They can't ask for help. They can't acknowledge missteps. All they can do is double and triple down on bad decisions, for example, or perpetuate really negative kinds of relational dynamics, because that's all that they know. And you can't, I think to not admit vulnerability is to never admit that you're wrong, or that you did, you went the wrong direction or something like that. So I think it has all kinds of really problematic knock-on effects.
As you're talking about it, I mean, what comes up for me with vulnerability is also like shame. And I'm kind of hearing you say those sorts of things, like not being able to be wrong and things like that. And that, I mean, I know that's something that I'm kind of sifting through in my own personal therapy, is like the cost of being wrong that, we grew up with, right? And how that connects to shame of, then I can't admit, I've got to double down. I've got to, like triple down or whatever, So anyways, I just wonder if you can kind of speak to that a little bit, just kind of how that shame manifests for men in particular that were raised in purity culture.
Yeah. Well, I think, that lack of vulnerability, oftentimes one of those emotions is shame. The one you can't say is, I feel ashamed about this. And I mean that like in the positives. Maybe you did something dumb, or you did something insensitive, or you hurt, like you screwed up. Like you were an a-hole to somebody and you didn't need to be. And in that sense, that everyday sense, you should feel ashamed of it, right? Like you treated somebody poorly and but instead of being able to say, I'm really embarrassed about this, or shame, or whatever, you get angry. Maybe you get angry at them for what they did, or you get defensive about it, or, or whatever it is. But I think shame, it's almost cliche, but it's cliche that it's true. Shame is like the heart of so much of this, right? And the way that it gets I mean, it is baked into us, those shame responses. And so what is that? I think I often work with clients, and I look at myself and wonder like what does shame feel like? Like what is your body doing when you're feeling shame? And for me, even talking about it here, I get a little sweaty, a little nervous, right? My body's like, you're talking about shame, and my body's like, hey, let's go into a shame response right here while we talk about it, right?
Yeah.
But whether you're perspiring or you're shaking or, all of those things. And then you tie into okay, well, how's that going to express itself to others?
Yeah.
And that shame can play into people who just shut down. They just can't engage, right? Their body's just like, fine, we're done. We're done. We're just going to shut down. And we know that. The people who just lash out, that was mine. I always had the fight response. Mine was to lash out and try to mask that shame, to externalize it in some way so that it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from somebody else. And all of those things, all the while often feeling shame for things we don't need to feel ashamed of, right?
Yeah,
Sexual desire. Oh, hey, guess what? You're a human being who's gone through puberty. Guess what that means for most of us? It means you're going to experience sexual desire. And in my view, there's a lot of perfectly developmentally and age appropriate ways that's going to express itself and play out. But when all of those are coded as negative, it means like core components of what we are the problem. And so shame, right? Like you transpose shame onto that, but it guarantees that it is going to be there, and it's going to be a primary operative emotion because it is now sort of hardwired into like basic human needs and responses and so forth. So you take that, and then you take not only do we not know how to express shame or acknowledge it or bring it out into the open, but we feel it for all these things we shouldn't feel it for. Yeah. And it's just a recipe for disaster. And it's like, oh, gee, no wonder there are so many screwed up people like me running around in the world being like, how do we untangle these things? Especially, and I'll throw this out there too, it can be really hard for people who are coming out of that, because then you start feeling shame about shame. Like you'd have shame responses for stuff that like maybe cognitively or intellectually, and Andrew, this goes to your point earlier about like, after deconstruction, these kind of lingering effects, you have stuff that shouldn't bother you anymore or shouldn't make you feel ashamed or embarrassed. But then when it does, you feel shame and embarrassment about that because that's your conditioned response when you make a mistake, which brings us back to vulnerability, right? We can't be vulnerable. So we got to be ashamed that we made a mistake or we got something wrong or we felt something we shouldn't or whatever. And it's the most pernicious cycle. Like you feel shame for feeling shame. And if you're not feeling shame for feeling shame, you're feeling shame for basically being a human and doing what humans do. And it's a really awful cycle. And one of the hardest things probably to untangle, which is why people like Laura Anderson, who knows her stuff, is like, hey, I'm still trying to figure out shame. It's like, good, great. Glad you're doing that. Doesn't bode well for the rest of us that you need to do that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. No. It was something that a therapist picked up on, and was like, oh, that's shame right there. Yeah. The whole like fear of being wrong, not knowing, having made a mistake. And when the consequence for that could potentially be eternal, or even thinking in the conversation that we're having, like with sex or sexuality, like if I engage in a sexual relationship with somebody who's not my future husband, then I could perhaps be ruining that, relationship in the future, or maybe that person won't even accept me. And now I'm going to be single old lady for the rest of my life. Like everything has such dire consequences.
Yeah.
And it makes it feel so much more shameful and intense. Yeah. And it just creates that
Again,
spiral effect.
it's my sound mixer metaphor, right? It takes like these dynamics that are there. Shame is not unique to religious people, right? It's not unique to people who grew up in purity culture, but you take all of that and to me, it just turns the volume up so high.
Yes.
That it literally drowns out everything else. It becomes the only thing that somebody can feel in so many domains of their life.
Yeah. And I think it's so important what you just mentioned a few minutes ago of that, like someone may cognitively know something, but still be feeling basically that nervous system response, like this thing that I'm experiencing, whether they're not aware of it cognitively, but my nervous system is perceiving this as a threat and is responding accordingly. And it's, quite literally can be debilitating.
Yeah.
But I also think it can be so normalizing, even just framing it that way. Like we're realizing like, no, it makes sense that your nervous system is responding this way. This is how, you spent decades being conditioned by these messages. There's nothing wrong with you. That's your nervous system doing what it's been told to do. But once you understand that, you can start doing something about it. But it's so powerful.
It's working to retrain the nervous system, and which is hard to do, but it can be encouraging to folks to know that they can. Especially, I often try to, we all do this with certain things, right? It's, maybe it's the person who they like riding roller coasters, but they kind of can't. And they throw Six Flags exposure therapy, I guess, where they go on some rides until they can. Or, the point is we can train our nervous systems, and that can be really encouraging for people, right? I feel like this is a learned habit, and habits are hard to break, but we can break habits and develop new habits. And, but it brings us back, I think, to that question of vulnerability, because that's, I think, to your point, Laura, right? Somebody else noting this, it's often something we can't do by ourselves because we can't see ourselves from the outside. We need other people sometimes to help us see that, or to see maybe the moments when we get it right. You start feeling like you're always getting it wrong, or you're always failing, or, whatever. And if you can't be vulnerable enough to have people in your world who can help you do that, that can be really difficult as well.
Absolutely. So I'm also curious too, we've touched on a little bit of this, but I'm interested just your thoughts on this particular binary that kind of gets set up in these systems. And that is the binary where purity culture, patriarchy, all of these things together kind of reduce men to either being predatory, or being protectors. And certainly I've definitely seen that within evangelicalism. But what would you say is the danger in that binary? Like, what does that do? What are the consequences of that?
The danger. No, there's a few. I think one is the way I often describe is like sort of, again, as I say, man, in his fallen state is predatory and all of that. And the role of when you become a Christian is to sort of reshape that energy, that predatory energy, into something good. That also is the responsibility that falls to women. Women's role is to have to like shape that predatory sexuality into something positive. And so it's into, family, producing the family and caring for your wife, and what is sort of redirection, I guess, of sexual energy. And so you get as you say, the protector. And that might be in some ways the kinder, gentler patriarchy, the protector sort of model. And I think there are a number of problems with it. One is, again, if you're not a fan of patriarchy, you're just not going to be a fan of the kinder, gentler patriarchy. There's that piece of it. I think plenty of women in the world who might be like, yeah, thanks, I don't need your protection, I'll take care of myself, or whatever. I think it also, even within that model, and I've known, and I'm thinking of my own experience. I'm thinking of people that I knew when I was, in that world. I'm thinking of people I talked to who I think are the best intentioned, the kinder, gentler patriarchs who care about their daughters, and their princess. You get a lot of the princess language, all that weird stuff, and but they're caring for them, and they're protecting them, and they're going to have they've got all these rules about who they can date and how and this and that, and highly regimented, and they mean the best. And I think that I think one of the problems is I think it places those women in danger, right? They're not taught how to discern for themselves some of these things, how to protect themselves, how to have autonomy over their own decisions and bodies and desires and so forth. And so I think it perpetuates a vulnerability that it's trying to protect against. It's almost like, in a different model, it's like if you've got, I've got a middle schooler and a high schooler now, I can't treat them like they're second graders. right? Like they're not, and it's not going to go well for them if I do, no matter how protective I might be. And so I think that's one problem with that protector model. I think another, just maybe a deeper problem with the protector model is it's both that predator protector model. I think it reduces everything else to an enemy. Everything is a threat. Threats are everywhere. The kid who wants to date your little girl, he's a threat. He's not a kid who wants to date your little girl or somebody that makes her happy when she wakes up and thinks about him, or, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be dating or whatever. It's just, it reduces everything to threat, which then keys in, we talk about the nervous system and stuff, right? Of course, we're going to feel threat responses all the time when the entire world is a threat. And then you get all the knock-on effects of that. And then I think also, again, back to this model of masculinities, what does being a protector mean, and how does that play out? And what if you're not the kind of man who can, fit some of that model? You're not big, or you're not tough, or you're not scary, or you're not intimidating, or you're not, all of these normative conceptions of what a quote unquote protector is. What if you're just not suited to be that kind of parent or husband or partner or son or brother, whatever your social role is? What if that's not who you are, and it's not who you're going to be? And now you are defined as broken in some way or as failed. You're not the right kind of man. So I think that model can be problematic in a lot of ways. I'm really glad that you highlight that, because I've had conversations with, evangelicals that I've known, and they're like, we get everything you're saying about the predatory stuff. That's terrible. That's bad, whatever. But like, that's not what this is. This is about protecting others and caring for others, and, fulfilling this divine task to, protect them until, adulthood and so forth. And trying to bring into view what I think are still the problems that come into that is a conversation I've had with a lot of people.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I don't know how familiar the two of you are with Scott Galloway. I know he's, mixed. People like him, people hate him, whatever. But he talks about like a new version of masculinity and has kind of an alliteration. And one of them is protection, but it's not protection of women because they're inferior. It's like protection of anybody that's around you because of their humanity. And such a different way of looking at like, what does it mean to, his language is like to be a man. You protect the people that you are around because they are humans deserving of protection. And that doesn't mean you have to go fight them.
Right.
There's so many different ways to protect, but I think that it can be really reduced when we only have that binary of, predator or protector. Well, you're protecting from the predators, and just depends who you're with, and that determines what role you're in for that day, because you're a man who's a sexually out of control animal. It really falls apart quickly and can lead to so much shame and, isolation, really. Yeah. So on that note, but maybe a weird turn, I was thinking back, we kind of talked about this a little bit the last time, I think it was the last time we recorded, this idea of kind of that, like male loneliness that seems to be coming up today. And I just am curious to know if you can speak to that a little bit, maybe the connection between religious patriarchy, purity culture, kind of this crisis of meaning that so many men seem to be facing today.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to write and can't write
That's
and talk
okay.
at the same time. There we go. I think it ties a lot with that language, that question of vulnerability. I think the so-called crisis of male loneliness seems to be a real thing. I mean, lots of people in lots of domains having nothing to do with religion and whatever will talk about this. The lack of close personal friendships that men have, the lack of deep connection, a sense of kind of social enemy that lots of men have, and I think there are lots of sort of contributing factors. But I think it's a real thing. The problem is, so we've got this kind of diagnosis, right? Here's a real problem. I think the issue is what solutions are on offer with that, right? And I think part of it is again, it's kind of baked in. I mean, the classic macho stereotype thing is, it's the lone man, the man who stands alone, the man who doesn't need others, the man who, all of that sort of stuff. And I think part of what we're finding with the crisis of loneliness is, guess what? It didn't work. We do need others, and do need connection, and do need meaningful, interactions and all those kind of things. And a lot of men have no idea how to do that. Why? Precisely because they've been conditioned and raised in all of these ways that downgrade all of that, right?
Yeah.
To not even not even just not express emotion, but to not even be aware what they are. And we've all had the experience. When we've experienced ourselves, or someone's, well, how does, X, Y, or Z make you feel? And it's like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't know how to name feelings. I don't know how to take the things my body's doing, right? All those, learned responses we have, and assign a name to it. I don't know what that emotion is. I don't let alone communicate it or know what to do with it. So I think a lot of men, and if we talk about the negative effects of patriarchy, this is one. And I think a lot of men are just starting out way behind the 8 ball, so to speak, when it comes to even relating to somebody, in emotional ways and so on. And then so often, the answer to it again is, ironically, not admitting vulnerability, not admitting emotion, the doubling down. And so if men are lonely, the problem is the world. The problem is that men are under attack. The problem is that people hate men. The problem is that society is anti-masculine. And, I'm working through this stuff in my podcast, so that's what's fresh in my mind. But it's that, it's not taking a step back and saying, well, maybe we need to think, among other things, about what have we taught men to be? And maybe there have been some problems with that. Or what have we not taught men to be? Vulnerable, communicative, to form healthy emotional attachments with others that are not sexual and not just with other men, and, all of those kinds of things. No, the problem is society. The problem is everybody who is, critical of a certain kind of masculinity, or everybody who's not straight, or everybody who's queer in some other way, whatever. And it just, again, that's the doubling down, I think, right? So you're trying to reshape the world, which isn't the problem. It's instead of having to take a look at, what have we taught men to be? What have we taught them that they need, or taught them that they don't need? And then when they do, we lash out at the world for being that versus, sort of teaching men. So I think it's a real thing. And I think it's a diagnosis, a sort of an awareness that lots of people across a political and religious spectrum recognize. But I think the solutions that are put forward, in sort of the conservative and high control religion world are they're the problems that have fed it, in my view.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about this specifically, and there's the whole, the male loneliness epidemic is a whole hashtag now, but it's something that's been happening, whether we called it that or not. Yeah. And I think what strikes me is just recognizing how young it starts too. And what I'm alluding to specifically is some conversations, might have been last season, we interviewed Angela Denker, and she has a recent book, Disciples of White Jesus, subtitle Radicalization of American Boyhood. American Boyhood, I think, yeah. But it's the radicalization of boyhood. And and just it's the things that we're talking about here. It's we absolutely see it. The recent leaking of the Young Republicans group chat, and just the crap that we're seeing there. The thing is everyone's so shocked at that, and yet the reality is, I used to work with teenage boys. I was a DJJ, outpatient therapist. I hate to say how common that is. Discord culture, 4chan, all these other that's. I'm not going to say all of them. I don't want to normalize it to that extent, but it is so prevalent. It does start young, and everything you just said. We're talking about men, but I'm also it is also boys. It is teenagers. It is preteens. It starts so young.
It's men, right? It's the people who will grow up to be men. And, you put it into the church context as well. And with this theme of radicalization, and we've talked about this in our podcast, and I know others have too, but you get the churches with they're having the men's retreat kind of thing. And they're it's all military games and stuff. It's all combat. It's all competition. There's a camaraderie there, obviously, and people who serve in the armed forces form deep commitments and attachments to others. I get all of that, but it's also this weird, even the response to loneliness is supposed to be what? More competition, more exercise of simulated violence, and on and on. I'm just that's going to fix the wiring, right? That's going to fix it when you got a bunch of 10, 11, 12, 15-year-olds who are conditioned to this is how you relate to other men, is somehow bonding only through competition or opposition, or whatever. Just to your point, that it starts young, it's religiously coded, right, and central in a lot of these frameworks, and it plays out in a lot of ways. It's very difficult, I think, to untangle.
And it strikes me that really feeds into then that definition of masculinity, and within purity culture, who are you supposed to be as a man, and how that impacts women, what they accept and what they expect, and how they relate too. I think that it all ties together.
Yeah, I mean, you could go a whole different direction, right? On like how it channels female desire, like what kind of man is supposed to be attractive, what kind of man
Totally.
will protect, like what does it mean to need a protector, what does it mean, on and on and on. But we told a silly story in our podcast, one of our supplementals. It's silly and embarrassing. I feel embarrassed, right? I'm going to share the emotion.
Good
right?
for you. Good for you.
But,
we like that.
But it's true. And it was this summer camp youth group thing that we went to, where somehow it always, for the guys, would always devolve into like contests of physical strength, right? And it turned into this push-up contest. And, somebody somewhere said that they could like crack a walnut between their shoulder blades doing push-ups. And like, I'm pretty sure humans can't do that. But it turned into this whole contest in this cabin with basically like the champion high school guy from each cabin, like in there doing push-ups and trying, like, it's just like, really, like that's the model of what male bonding has to be, like, or male connection. It has to be competition. It has to be, all of that. It just closes off other avenues. And it's not that can't be a thing. I love, going out and competing at something as much as the next person. But there's more to life than just competition and just opposition and just a kind of, fight to be the strongest. And in that alpha male model, there can be only one, right? Somebody's got to be the alpha, which means everybody else isn't.
Right.
It's not a model for fostering deep, meaningful, lasting connection, I don't think. And it, to your point again, Andrew, it starts young. And when you code the religion to it and so forth, it's really deeply bred in there. And I think it shows with all the statistics now about young men, and for the first time in the hundreds of years, maybe, men participating in church outnumbering women, and the draw of young men to church and to these models of masculinity and so forth. I think that this is a really telling and significant social issue.
Yeah. It strikes me as interesting, based what you're saying there is like, we have this loneliness, right? It's there's so much that's baked in. So now the church is coming and providing this sense of community and connection, which really is what can bust up shame, is like not being alone and feeling a sense of connection, but yet they're promoting an isolating masculinity, right? Which just like perpetuates the entire cycle that we're talking about here, and then shifts the way that we interact with other people, and, right down to purity culture and all of that.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it is, there's, I think, a deep contradiction at some level, right? On the notion of connection only through competition. Right. And I think that's what it fosters. Again, everybody's a potential rival. Everybody's a potential threat. And there are real connections that form around things like that. I recognize that. But I think that there's also a contradiction there when that's all that there is. Or when we take that not as, here's something we enjoy doing and, whatever. And so we go and do it. And you beat me today. And okay, fine. Versus this is what it is to be a man, right? You're a competitor. You're, the strongest, you're the best, you're the whatever. I think that makes it really hard to relate to other people as equals, right? Because you're trying to be unequal. That's the whole point.
It's baked in. Yeah, that's the whole point. Yeah.
I really appreciated everything we've covered so far. We've definitely established, I think, the ways that purity culture and patriarchy, and especially the combination of those two, can create very real problems, and how young it does start. I also want to really touch on healing, recovering, if that's even possible, and so I'm just curious, what does healing look like for men recovering from the harms of patriarchy and purity culture, and not just intellectually, but also somatically, relationally, spiritually, for example?
I think one point has to be, and if you get to the question of like what brings somebody to this point, I think that's going to be as varied as the individuals who are there. But somebody recognizing that what they're doing doesn't work, that the solutions that they're trying, whether consciously, unconsciously trying to do this, or whether it's just a learned response that's become, it's become maladaptive. It's not helping do the things that they want it to do, and recognizing that they need some sort of an outside view. They just need somebody with some critical distance to like help them try something different, or, or whatever. And, I talked about me being, angry all the time. So it was messing up relationships that I had. It was causing me trouble, in my professional context. And I finally was like, I need to figure out how to not just be pissed off all the time. Like, cliche, it went deeper than I thought it did, and was, a lot of work and all that kind of stuff. And I still wrestle with it. But whatever that kind of tipping point is of bringing somebody to that point of I think unfortunately often it's a high enough level of social disruption or relational disruption or dysfunction or something that they realize something needs to happen. But then once you're to that, whether that's therapy or coaching or whatever that is, one of the things that I think can help is I think before we can change behaviors, oftentimes we've got to be aware that they're there, and we're often not, right? They're just things that we do. We just do them. They're habits. And one of the things I often do is, sort of a stage is I'll start with somebody and say like, what are some, okay, you're talking about this messing up social relationships or disrupting your relationship with a partner, or maybe it caused a conflict at work. Let's just go back and dissect that a little bit. What did that look like? What did it, and beginning to go from there to getting them to recognize, like, what are the precursors of that? Was there a particular person? Is there a particular topic? What is it that triggers that sort of thing? You start to recognize that. But then I often spend a lot of time working back to that embodied dimension and actually working with clients to create a little bit of a distance from their body, in the sense of, I try not to ask sometimes, what do you feel when this happens? Or when you responded to your coworker that way, what were you feeling? Because I find they often have a hard time answering that question. What I'll do is say, if you can safely kind of imaginatively enter that space again, or sometimes it's as they go along, they become more aware of this, and initially they can't cut it off, but maybe they'll be aware shortly after. And I'll say to them, what was your body doing when that happened? Right?
Yeah.
Not what were you doing? What was your body doing? Not what were you feeling, but what was it? And it's everything from posture. I realize that, I get real tense, or I feel, this knot in my stomach, or I got loud, or I stand up, or, whatever it is, beginning to recognize that and sort of beginning to try to get that sense of, okay, so you're naming the emotion, maybe anger or whatever. Here's what your body's doing. So let's maybe start working on, can you feel your body starting to do that? Or what are other things you can do to start teaching your body to do something different? And the emotion kind of follows from that oftentimes, right? Because I think a lot of times people know what the emotion is. Like if they get to that point of needing help, they know what the emotion is. The problem is that it's always there. Like, I get it. It's there. What do I do about it? And so that's one of the ways I do is in sort of working backwards from there and helping them to just become really aware of what their body does. I think emotions are, embodied states. And then working to start reprogramming the body. Again, I use an example a lot. I teach in Vermont, and I drive down to Massachusetts. And so certain times of the year, there'll be like, bad weather. And I often will realize as I'm driving that my shoulders are up on my ears and my hands are tense. I'm driving in this, I'm white knuckling my way through a snowstorm. Like, oh my gosh, I gotta loosen up. And guess what? I'm calmer now by, consciously bringing my body into a different kind of alignment. And people recognize this. People recognize this with mindfulness exercises. They recognize this with breathing exercises and centering, and we'll use some of those things, but really helping them to start, what does my body do? How can I learn to accept that it does that? And then maybe help it start figuring out how to do something different, whether that's just putting your shoulders down. Or if this was one of mine, I wave my hands around. I'm gonna keep my hands on my chair in a meeting. I'm gonna keep my hands on a chair, and if I can't wave my hands around, I stay calmer. And so learning to use their bodies, which puts them in touch with their bodies, makes them aware of their bodies, lets them listen to their bodies. I think lets them start naming different kinds of emotions that might come with that. Lets them change the way that the body expresses itself, lets them change the way others are perceiving those emotions. And then I think that can often then come, like, once you've got that, then you can start sort of working on, naming what those other emotions might be. What other words do we want to use here? Are there ways of other ways of expressing what it is that we were expressing that we didn't know is what we were expressing in our body, right? It's things we tell kids. We're like, use your words, right? But we're all still learning to do that. And so those are some of the sort of processes that I take through. I think a lot of it comes with that embodied dimension, because I think that's the part that is often outside of somebody's conscious control. And if we could fix it consciously, none of us would ever need any help. We would just be like, oh man, I was a jerk yesterday. I'm not going to do that again. And we'd go about our merry way, but that's not usually how it works.
Yeah. Yeah. If only, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Nope, not doing that again,
Yeah, exactly. We talked earlier about, shame, vulnerability, and I just wonder if we can speak to that, like in the recovery piece too. Like, how do men who are wanting to heal, like, work through some of that shame or that defensiveness, the fear of being wrong, or just simply not get stuck in that?
Yeah. So I use a lot, and there's different ways, obviously, and the two of you know a lot, a lot of ways of doing this. One of the ways I do a lot of parts language with my clients, right? And how
We love that here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. I mean, that's part of why I'm doing stuff with the center, right? Um, I often use the analogy that, we're like a little committee. We're not like these single things. We're like, there's a committee of us. And we all understand this. You go out to eat lunch or something and somebody's like, what are you going to get? You're like, I don't know. Like, part of me wants the burrito, but part of me thinks the fajitas this time is the way to go, right? We've got that sense. And I'll try to get them to see like what, well, let's just call it the shame part. Recognizing that shame response at some point it developed because it was trying to help you in some way. It kept the pastor off your back, right? Or if I didn't go too far with that girl or whatever, I'm a good Christian. I'm, this, or my parents will let me still go on dates. Whatever it is, there's something it was doing to help you, to try to protect you. And the problem is it's just turned on all the time now, and it doesn't need to be. But so first of all, starting to recognize that there was, that there was a positive benefit that was trying to do. And so recognizing that, because I think we all know that when you just try to shut the door on these things, they just pound their way back through. So being able to sort of invite it in and be like, okay, like, how did the shame help me? There were concrete ways in which it helped me somehow, somewhere, at some point in my life. And I'm not there anymore. But once we begin to acknowledge that, then we can start kind of working on that part to kind of say, hey, cool, thank you. But you can you get the day off now. You can or you can we can turn the volume back down. And I find sometimes clients think that parts language is weird. Sometimes it feels really intuitive to them.
Yeah.
But it can be really, I find it a useful way because they begin to kind of attune themselves that way. We'll meet with them and they'll be like, yeah, this week that the shame voice has been really loud, and the strategies I've had for kind of helping it to like chill out haven't really been working. It's like, okay, so let's talk more about that. But I guess just listening to and accepting those different pieces of us and those different voices in us that are trying to do good things, but they're not. And I'm an academic. I was a chair for a long time, and I'll talk about, you get faculty meetings. You got that one faculty member over there who like, every time their hand goes up, you're like, oh, geez, here it is. And it's not productive to deal with them that way. If you can reframe it, you're like, you know what, this person wants what's best for the department. They're trying to do the best they can, whatever. Maybe I can hear them in that spirit and help try to, put that to good use. It's the same way that we can deal with these parts of ourselves. And so I work with clients a lot in that. And it's something I find myself doing a lot of, as you kind of come to terms with your own weird parts that come back out, and you're like, oh, hey, I hadn't heard from you in a while. Thought we dealt with that. Let's, why are you making noise now? And just trying to understand that, I think, also helps to bring all these things that just happen into some way that we can kind of bring in front of us, and we can start making a conscious part of what we're doing, and we can start changing those habits and patterns over time.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So this next question is still in the vein of kind of like helping folks, but this is less of a practitioner approach, but like as a parent. So as a father, how do you approach raising boys or mentoring men in a way that affirms strength without domination, and softness without shame?
Yeah, I think one is, again, you talk about the starting young, and this is going to maybe seem so obvious now that, it's like a bygone era or whatever, but like when a kid needs to cry, let them cry. Right. Or foster their interests. I mean, again, these seem like really basic things, but if your kid is into the video games, then they're into the video games. If they're into like artistic stuff, they're into artistic stuff. If they want to try sports, let them try sports. And all the things about, again, I think they're cliche, but they can be hard to do. Go out there and do your best. And is the kid going to be any good? Don't know. Don't know. But they want to go try it. So let them try it versus the overcoaching or the, all those habits that you can fall into. So I think it just, in a lot of ways, boils down to a lot of affirmation, trying to affirm the person that they're sort of emerging into and what that is, together with things like, cultivating the ability, I think, for kids, you want them to be able to stand up for themselves or voice their needs, or if they feel like they've been mistreated in some way, to communicate that. But also, I do want my kids to be advocates for others. I have told my kids, I'm like, the one thing that I will not respond to well is if I ever find out that they're the ones bullying somebody else, right? Like that kind of thing. So a kind of care. And, it's interesting. We talked about that language of protection. I think I find myself avoiding language of protection, but language of like maybe nurturing or care, right? Nurturing others, caring for others, strong sense of empathy. Like, how would you feel if you heard somebody talking about you this way? And here you are doing, trying to cultivate all of those, the awareness of others, and together with an affirmation of sort of who they are. And I think another piece as a parent is sometimes you'll feel, I don't know, discomfort or embarrassment or fear or whatever. And I think sometimes we have to ask, is that about my kid or is it about me?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, am I really worried about my kid, or am I worried about it somehow reflecting on me in some way? And if I'm worried about the latter, that's my problem. Like I need to not put that on my kid. That's my issue to deal with. So, I think those are some of the basic things. Again, they all sound really cliche, but I think they're hard to do, right? And kids make mistakes. Sometimes you see things coming, you're like, this is a slow moving train wreck, and I think I kind of need to let it happen. Like they're going to maybe have to go down this path and realize that this is not the thing for them, or that this is not going to end well, obviously, as long as it's not hurting others and so forth. And just kind of creating this space for them to emerge as who they are, I think is the key. And then trying to, I guess maybe a last point on this notion of protection is trying to help them become the people who won't need you. If that makes sense. How do they teach them to make decisions? How do you let them have made enough mistakes that they realize that people make mistakes and that they can come with costs, but that you can sort of pick yourself up and dust yourself off? Or how do you try to cultivate relational skills in them so that, someday that they can do that and they're not going to need you to protect them, not creating a relationship of just kind of forever dependence, right? And I guess give me another 20 years and we'll see how it turns out. But, those are some things I try to do, I think, as a parent, and specifically a parent of a son in particular.
Yeah. I love that. That's helpful. I don't have children of my own, but I have a handful of nieces and nephews. And so I feel like with the nieces in particular, I'm like, okay, I think I've got this a little bit, that sort of thing. And with the boys, it's like, all right, I need to learn a few more things here. So that's helpful to hear. One of the questions that we're asking all of our guests this year is, if you could go back and say something to your younger self, maybe the pastor version of you, or the purity culture, masculine, immersed in evangelical ministry, whatever it is, what would that be?
I feel like it's funny. It's something I would have, at the time, it's something I would have told other people, but I did not apply it to myself well. I think we all know that, right? When it's somebody else, we've got see perfectly well what they need to do. So it would just cut yourself some slack, and cut others some slack. Like, eternity is not riding on this. It's really not. It's really not. If I don't know, if two teenagers have sex before they're married, like, if that's the biggest thing God has to worry about, then okay.
Wow.
Like, that just feels so out of balance to me. And I think that's what it would be, is just to loosen up and just to extend more grace, if you wanted to put it in theological terms, right? Those same high control religionists talk a lot about grace, but I think it's not very exercised within those contexts. And it would be to, I think, just imagine what it would be like if you really extended the radical grace that you say you believe in to yourself and to others. What would your practices actually be? I think something like that.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Well, I know there's a million more conversations that we could be having, but I think we'll kind of close it up there for the day. Dan, it's been so wonderful to have you. Thanks for everything that you've shared. And for people who are wanting to, hear more about this, follow your work, get in touch with you, give us all the ways that people can follow and connect with you.
Yeah, so anything with Straight White American Jesus, you just Google that and find it. I do a series every Wednesday on there. Brad Onishi and I do a weekly roundup every week. We do live events. And so that's the clearest way. People can subscribe. If they do, we have a Discord that people can be a part of. I also, old school, have an email that I actually get stuff from. I hear from listeners all the time, and I get great emails from things. It's just Daniel Miller Swag, Daniel Miller, SWAJ at gmail.com, and love to hear people there as well. And anywhere else that they want to try to look for us and find us. They reach out through Straight White American Jesus. I get things in there as well. But yeah, love to hear from people about just things that are making sense to them, things that are not making sense to them, things that we could talk about on our podcast. Yeah, love to hear it.
I love it. I love it. We'll make sure that we include all of that in the show notes so that people can get in touch with you. And, I highly recommend Straight White American Jesus. If you're not already listening to it, make sure you do. Got your Wednesday episodes, and that's where
and
you
now
can get all
on
the Dan
YouTube
Miller knowledge
and everything.
Oh,
so
nice!
I know,
nice. Yeah,
I know. That's its own weird
Yeah.
thing. That's why I've got the camera that I don't fully know how to use yet. So it responds to hand signals and does weird things, and yeah, so people can get a laugh with that. So yeah.
I love it. That's so good. Well, Dan, thank you so much for being here today. It's just been wonderful to have this conversation with you.
No, thanks for having me. I love it. And yeah, maybe I'll get on in the future and earn the blazer. So I'm
yes,
I'm
yeah.
game for it,
I mean, I think you and Brad might be neck and neck in terms for who's been on the podcast the most. So, duke it out and we'll give you a jacket.
Any way I can get ahead of Brad, because we want to talk about emotions, the inferiority I have because of Brad's great hair. And so if I can just
Brad
be here
does
more
have
than
good
Brad,
hair.
He has great hair. So
Really
I'm never going to
does,
beat him
yeah.
on that. So maybe I can get the blazer sooner
Yeah.
than him, and that'll do it.
Okay. We'll come up with some other conversations we can have and pull you back in. We'll leave Brad off the season or something for this
That's
year.
right.
So
Yeah, nobody tell Brad that we're talking about this. So yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much to Dan Miller for being a three-peat guest on our podcast. We are going to try to get a few more episodes with him so he can be winning the race of, the best Sunday school dropout. But Andrew, I don't know about you. I really appreciated this conversation. I, of course, as a woman, recognize that, purity culture impacted women and those socialized female in a very specific and unique way. But I don't think anybody wins in purity culture. And so I think that it's also really necessary to have these conversations about the impact that it can have or did have and still does have on men. And I think it's necessary to just be pretty frank and open about how men were impacted and how that can continue to impact them even after having left purity culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a great conversation to have. Very, very much a needed one. Because it is a thing where we can admit that men created a lot of these frameworks with misogyny and patriarchy and all of the ways that those pieces inform purity culture, and also it does still harm men, even though in a lot of ways it targets women as far as control, the focus of control. But yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
It comes at a cost. And I just really appreciate Dan coming on and talking with us.
Yeah, it struck me as really interesting because I've heard this before from people in my personal and professional life. This idea of one of the things that some men struggle with is even if you've done everything the quote unquote right way and you get to your wedding night and you're about to have sex with your now wife, that feeling of maybe having defrauded this person or doing something wrong because you've been taught for such a long time that, sex is bad and dirty and evil and sinful. And I think a lot of women struggle because our bodies aren't meant to be light switches off and on, right? And so that's part of the struggle for women is their bodies can have a really adverse response to it. But I feel like I hear more and more from men that their minds are it's a really difficult cognitive issue for them because of how the way purity culture has lived in their bodies and brains of what sex means and how it's supposed to go. And anyways, I thought it was really interesting that Dan hit on that, because that is something I think that probably more men than not, like struggle with coming out of purity culture. That is something that can come up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, it's not a switch. You were referring to women, but I mean, for men too, like the way that it shows up in your nervous system, the shame, just the messaging. Of course, in men's case, it's the messaging is more that, men can't help themselves. They're inherently more violent, aggressive, even predatory. And yeah, a lot of that does get internalized as shame, and that also affects sexuality and arousal. And that absolutely can affect men. And because it's not a thing that, even if you do everything right, if that's the programming and you have all of this embodied shame, you can't just flip the switch like, oh, well, I'm doing it right, so that's not affecting me anymore. Like, it still affects you. You can't just like cognitively decide it's not going to affect you one day. And that's why being trauma informed and understanding the nervous system and how embodiment works is so important and healing from this.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. So, who knows? Maybe we'll have Dan back on in the future, even this season. And so I'm excited for him to continue doing his research on this topic as well as talking about it. But yeah, we are very glad to have had Dan on the podcast. If you want to get in touch with Dan, his information will be in the show notes. He does see clients as a practitioner at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. If you don't listen to his podcast, Straight White American Jesus, I would encourage you to do that. It's available on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. He does a special series every Wednesday, really diving deeper into kind of coded language of evangelicalism. And he goes through different books where he does a deep dive into evangelical culture on specific issues. And so, yeah, you can catch him there on Wednesdays or on Fridays for the weekly roundup. So with that, I think we're done with another episode. And that means that all God's people said, Amen.
Amen.